Bob Murphy Show, episode 357.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Keith Dixon, who is the author of Paul's Journal. I'll just read the bio on the back of the book. Keith Dixon graduated from Hillsdale College with a degree in history before finishing law school and becoming in-house counsel for a small engineering firm. He never expected to write this book, so Paul's Journal sat in a computer file for the better part of a decade before Keith finally finished the manuscript. By the grace of God, who kept him safe through some fairly wild years, Keith lives with his wife, fellow Hillsdale grad Jenica, their 3 children, and their German Shepherd in an idyllic western Wisconsin neighborhood. So with that teaser, let's jump right into it. I think you'll enjoy this conversation with Keith Dixon. Well, Keith, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So what we're covering, folks, is Keith's book, Paul's Journal, as I'm showing here in the video if you're watching the video version. So the obvious question is to first ask you, Keith, what's the book about? What do you mean Paul's Journal? What is that?
Well, it's kind of hard to classify exactly what the book is. And in fact, I got my first negative review back just yesterday, and it was, it started out, I thought I was going to like the book. It started out pretty good, but then it became clear that there's no revisionism in it, and it's not going to be comical at all. And it's basically the same old boring Paul is Acts. And that's fine with me because it's a Christian book and I'm not looking to change who Paul is. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when you kind of read between the lines, is the book's categorized as historical fiction. Mm-hmm. And so this reader in particular was looking for a lot more drama than was actually there. And what the book is the story of Paul's life from his perspective. So the Apostle Paul is telling you about the events of his life, the things he went through from the stoning of Stephen on. And I think of it a lot like if you watch TV, The Chosen or something. Mm-hmm. There's so much that they have to fill in just to make a movie. You don't know what people are wearing. And I think of Paul's Journal like that. I filled in those gaps, those small details for so that I could make it a coherent story. And on the other side, the book goes through chapter 4, and that's up through Acts. But the last chapter is almost wholly made up to get from the end of Acts to the end of Paul's life. So that section is more historical fiction than the rest of it, which follows Acts more closely. But so it's a little bit harder to classify there.
Okay, so what was guiding you? And I'm glad you brought up like The Chosen. There's Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ. You could use that as an example. There's different. Of course, everyone remembers Charlton Heston as Moses and so forth. So, what was guiding you? Like clearly. I say this, but I mean, partly because I was talking to you and I looked at the book, but you weren't going to go out of your way to contradict anything blatantly that was clearly one way in scripture, and then you're going to write something totally different. But what was guiding you in terms of filling in things? Like just, I'll add really innocuous things, or, hey, why don't we have him, being attracted to this guy's wife? Or you get what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Well, you're being the revisionist that my critic was looking for, actually.
Right.
The book really started out, I didn't start with the intention of writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
I just had some questions about some events in Paul's letters and how in the world would that fit into the book of Acts. So I laid out the book of Acts, and then I took my notes from Paul's letters and I took those events and tried to work them together to see how that fleshed out. And then I realized it would be easier, it'd make more sense if I started taking more contemporary events too, what the Romans were doing, what the other Jewish people in Paul's time were doing. So I started incorporating those events into the book also, and to kind of get myself a timeline so things would make more sense for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then as time rolled on, it developed into this massive monster where I had a narrative, but I also had these huge historical blocks just dropped right in there. And I had theological speculation just dropped in there, like massive pages. And then I set it on a shelf and didn't look at it for years. And it sat there until I found it just about 2 years ago. And I went through and I said, this is a complete book. Mm-hmm. So I printed up test copies and sent them to a few friends to read and get an idea. Is this something I throw away? Do I scrap it?
Can I stop you though? At this point, was it in the first person, or you just meant you had like a timeline and and then this happened to Paul, and then this happened to Paul?
It was in the first person.
Okay.
So I did kind of outline. My outlines have always been kind of stories though. So I fill out an outline very full, even right from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So I kind of flush it out from there, and it's easy once I started pulling in all this information from Roman history, from Jewish history, backstories from the Bible, to start seeing the world and seeing the world around Paul and describing how it felt. And that's really where the I did this and I did that came from, is because it was easy from my perspective to see it. It was easy for me to say, I did this, I did that. And that's what I found a couple of years ago. It was a completed book. It was just a very bad book. So I printed up the test copies, sent them to several people, and everything came back completely unanimous. This is absolutely a great story, but I can't stand these historical sections and all this data that you felt you needed to plug in there. So
can you give us an example of like what you mean?
Well, I have some theories about the Sadducees and Pharisees and that divide and where it came from and how it separated, which isn't the Pharisees and Sadducees are very relevant for Paul's time in the book.
Sure.
But all that minutia is just it's just not anything the average Christian really needs to deal with in their life. And they don't need to understand that at all to understand Paul's times.
But I'm sorry to dive into it, but I'm curious on this. So, but just so I understand, in that first draft that they were saying, yeah, we like this story, but did you have like Paul saying, now when it comes to the Sadducees and Pharisees, a lot of people don't know it. Like, was it still his journal, but people were like, why is Paul getting into these, his journals periodically interesting and boring? Like that was how you wrote it?
Yeah, it was Paul the lecturer.
Okay,
so.
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so they gave you that feedback, and so then did you respond to it, or you said, no, pearls before swine, this is how it's supposed to be?
No, I decided if I'm going to put the time and effort into it, I've got to switch my perspective, and I've got to write it for other people and what other people will want. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest with you, that's not my strength. To consider other people. I'm pretty good at, I like it this way. And
well, it wasn't Paul's strength either, right?
Yeah, there you go.
I don't think a lot of people like those letters.
My cover. Yeah, exactly. But that feedback that I got was so clear that it just absolutely paved the way for where this book needed to go. And it became, what would really edify the average Christian? What would push them to to the edge of fun. So I want to keep within fun and interesting to read,
Mm-hmm.
but really push them to learn more and get more out of this. And with that, those two concepts in mind, I went back and stripped out all those massive sections. I took out a lot of history that is important, but I included that in an appendix in the back. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that you have a very concise history going down to Paul's time, of the information you need. None of the heavy stuff in the book, but everything in the story itself that really gives you a picture of what it was like back then and what it would have been like for Paul.
Okay. So is it, like I think a lot of, especially Protestant listeners, and not to exclude Catholics, I'm just saying I'm more familiar with, even though I was raised Catholic, that I'm not trying to cater to stereotypes, but we did not study the Bible, at least my Catholic friends and I, whereas my Protestant friends and I do. And so like you can read a commentary, there's lots of commentators and they'll bring in historical things like, oh, when Jesus, this letter to the church in Philadelphia, here's what you need to know about the background of that city at the time, and here's where it's located. So there's a lot of stuff like that where, so now the text that's in the actual Bible makes more sense to me as a modern reader because now are you doing just that? Not that that's a mere thing, like that's an important thing, or are you doing something more than that as well?
I've actually tried to even avoid that as much as I could.
Okay.
So I'm looking to give the image and the of what was happening to Paul in a narrative without a lot of the without spelling anything out.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to pause and give a description. There are places in the book that I have an editor put something in parentheses that is important to clarify, but I tried to minimize that also, and that led to a couple of decisions as far as what goes in and what comes out, was whether I can put it in Paul's voice naturally or whether it has to be an editor note. And if it has to be an editor note, then how detailed am I willing to make that without throwing the reader off? And remember, it's not what I like anymore. It's what the reader likes. So so that was what I was shooting for. And there's things in I think it's Thessalonians. Paul talks about sending Timothy back to the Thessalonians, and there are two places this could go in the book, and it's a small note. It may be very, very important for the the church there, but it's not really important for the story to move the story along. And I decided that there's just too much detail that I would have to spell out and explain to the reader to make that fit in the story. Paul sending Timothy back, and so that got left out. So to avoid distracting theological explanations, I did leave some things out that I would have put in if it was a more technical book. Okay.
So let me ask this: if someone listening to this is a Bible believing Christian, and why would they get this? I'm not trying. I'm just let me just go ahead and ask it that way. So sell this person on the book? Why do I care about this? If what's in this that I couldn't just go read Acts and the epistles and get the same information out?
Yeah, I got some feedback, and one person gave me the feedback that she never knew that Paul had been she knew Paul persecuted Christians, but she never understood that Paul actually fundamentally thought that he was acting for God when he was persecuting Christians. And that shocked me, because that's something that's clear to me.
Right.
And I realized when we read Acts, Acts has everything you need. You do not need my book to understand the Bible. You only need the Bible. That's the bottom line. But when you've read Acts over and over, there are, if you see the picture painted a different way, it could bring some of the parts of Acts to life for you or alive to you in a way that you
Mm-hmm.
haven't seen it before. And it could bring some of those, oh, I was lacking there. This makes more sense to me now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the value that my book brings.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. That resonated. Your specific example there resonated with me because when I was younger, I also didn't get that either until subsequent readings, and then it more clicked with me. And that's also, it makes it more interesting to think about, the road to Damascus, and then like in other words, it'd be one thing, the guy who's the slave trader, and then he comes to Jesus and writes Amazing Grace, or like he probably kind of knew he was doing something that wasn't great.
Right.
Whereas here, to think, oh no, it's not that I was a murderer because I was just some common criminal. Like, no, I thought I was killing heretics and like people who were blaspheming the one true God, these, Christians or whatever. And so then to realize, oh wait, they were right. Like that
right.
like, geez, what would that do to somebody? Oh, well, the Bible tells you, look what happened to this guy.
Kind of the ultimate oops.
Right. So I don't know. So how did you, because I used to think that like in terms of, let me just throw this out and then you can respond, obviously. That's partly what just when I'm sitting there trying to get into his head or everything, to think like he had that whole framework, and presumably it wasn't just that God chose him for this particular task because, hey, I just want to prove to people that anybody can flip, I can do whatever I want. Anybody can be saved and redeemed, but also his training, like it helps for him to then theologically explain doctrinal issues, having been trained in all of that, but then to be able to show, oh, this is why Jesus actually is the fulfillment of the law. And so like you would need an expert in the law to be able to show why Jesus fulfills it, among other things. Right. So I don't know. Do you have any response to that? I know I'm just like stating things.
No, I know what you mean. It's actually really interesting. Paul is the ultimate outsider apostle. If you go back to, I think it's Acts 2, maybe it's even Acts 1, I don't remember, but Judas dies. So Judas is out of the picture, and the other apostles get together and say, okay, let's replace Judas. We got to have 12. There's 12 tribes of Israel. Let's get back to 12 apostles. So how are we gonna select someone? And it comes down to two possible people here. There's two candidates for that office. And the reason they chose these two candidates was because these two candidates had been with them all the way back to John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, all 12 apostles grew up under Jesus. They learned Jesus's ways. They, the clear and honest and open and firm when you need to be firm, but also a little bit softer with people. And they replaced Judas with another person who grew up the same way with the same background. And Jesus said, we need something with a little bit more punch here. And he goes to this Saul character who is just a force, just a driven force, and says, let's stop with the persecution. I'm real. You got to face that I'm real. You got to face that that I am the one true God. And by the way, I need you to work for me now. And it just, for all Paul's energy and anger and everything that he'd thrown himself into behind persecuting Christians, you almost see some sense of relief when God says, no, you're going about this all wrong. All your energy is just being blown away on the wrong things. Mm-hmm. So let's redirect your wastefulness of yourself wastefulness and direct harmfulness of yourself. And you're going to be the builder of my church.
Mm-hmm. And also in terms of like, hey, God can forgive any sin, like what better candidate than to pick him? Whereas if it had been like a Ned Flanders
Right.
kind of guy who was like, oh no, like I said, gosh darn it, the other day when I, smacked my thumb with the hammer and Jesus died for that. So, that's fine. Like to be okay. But you can imagine other people saying, yeah, but no, Ned, you don't know what I did. He wouldn't forgive me. No, I'm going to hell. And so anyway, you get the silly point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good point. You couldn't have had a better display for the people of the time and for everybody for 2,000 years now to look at and see, okay, Paul can be saved. I'm hopefully not that bad, but maybe I am. But we got a great example that shows it really is everybody.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't be snarky about it, but sometimes on like social media, when there's somebody who claims to have converted, like a former porn star or something, and then you get a bunch of Christians piling on saying no. And then I would say something like, oh, it's not like she was, stoning martyrs or something, it's like, it's not like she was holding the coats of people stoning martyrs, right? And then, so like, okay, Murphy. So anyway, that's always a good way to troll people.
Well, it's important though. It's, we live in a world that is not, we're not isolated as Christians. And this is kind of corny, but I always think of it as, there are keep Christians and wall Christians. So if you think of the old castles, you've got the world that is out there attacking and that we need to engage with. And if your faith is not strong and you're very susceptible to how other people think, then you need to go lock yourself up in the keep and keep yourself safe. Like Lord of the Rings, when the women and children are back in the keep safely. But the rest of us are supposed to engage with this world. We're supposed to interact with it, and we need to get out to the walls, and we need to not necessarily fight. Certainly some things we need to fight on, but the bigger thing is a peaceful interaction and understanding. And we need to have those dialogues. So I think it seems kind of silly at the time when you say something like that, but it's important that those things are said and that the people that are essentially putting their hand out to block people who want faith are rebuked in some way.
Right. Oh yeah. To be clear. Yeah. I say it deliberately and intentionally, like, cause I do think they're wrong. Like, obviously I get somebody might be doing something for publicity or whatever, and we should be wary, but on the other hand, like, no, I'm not, it's not up to me to decide whether someone's conversion is genuine or not. And I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and certainly not do things that would dissuade other people from publicly saying, oh yeah, I used to be a sinner and I was, a drug addict or whatever, and now Jesus saved me. Like, I don't want them to be worried that if they say that, they're going to get mocked by ostensible Christians. Like, that's crazy to me.
Right.
So,
well, I actually got a pretty easy there because with my background, I've got no business criticizing anyone.
Okay.
So it was a rough road for me.
Well, it's funny because am I allowed to say where you went to school? Is that
sure?
That's not, yeah. So you had it on the back of your book. Yeah. So folks, before we started, Keith and I were chatting because we were both at Hillsdale, and then I was a professor there when he was a student, and yeah, so when I was a student there, I called myself a devout atheist. And so it's funny, kids who knew me at that time and then later heard, like, Bob Murphy's a Christian now? And they're like, their minds are blown. Like, I would like to think, I was a very polite, courteous atheist, you know what I mean? But nonetheless, like, I was going around trying to free people from their silly superstitions. And fortunately, I don't think I was successful with anybody, thank goodness. So, okay, well, you mentioned one thing in the preface or introduction, whatever, that I thought was funny. You said how there's two little parts where, hey, I encourage Catholic readers to enjoy the book as well. I think you mentioned two things about just to warn you. And so one was James, the brother of the Lord, and the other was the Paul versus Peter standoff. You want to talk about those two?
Sure. I really do hope that Catholics can enjoy this book too. And I don't see any reason they can't. but there are some things that it just doesn't smooth out nice and easily. And with James, the brother of the Lord, the Catholic Church, and that's from the Bible. It does say James, the brother of the Lord, but the Catholic Church interprets that more as a cousin, or it says brother, but it means Christian brother or something like that. So it doesn't interpret it as a literal brother. And I thought maybe I'll call him James the Just, but to my ears that sounds Catholic. So it felt like I had to choose sides there, even if it was unintentional. So I wanted to point that out to Catholic readers out of respect. So,
yeah, I was going to say, can I stop before you move on to the next one? Just something that came with. So again, I was raised Catholic. I went through confirmation in the Catholic Church, and then went out, and then my faith fell away. But yeah, so when I read the Bible with fresh eyes and saw how prima facie it referred to Jesus having brothers and sisters, and like, hey, aren't those your brothers and sisters outside that want to talk to you? And then he says, who are my brothers? These people here. I was surprised by that. And I just had thought, I guess nobody ever harped on that. But then I was surprised recently to learn, because I mentioned it on Twitter, and then a bunch of Catholics were telling me, their interpretation that either, like you're saying that, no, when the Bible's, because they believe, right, that Mary never had any other kids.
Right.
And my understanding is, right, like some of them believe she was perpetually a virgin.
Correct.
Is that right? And so that's a very important thing for them, and hence it's not just a casual, like, did Jesus have biological brothers or sisters? Like, it's it's a pretty big deal.
Right. Which would make Joseph the saint, but
yes. So right. So the two theories I heard were the one you said that it's like cousins, and they just use that terminology, whatever. And the other I heard was that maybe Joseph had biological children from a prior marriage, and that the Bible just doesn't talk about that. So anyway, those are the two. But I was surprised. I didn't realize they had a whole system to explain those things away. I just assumed, we don't talk about this or something, and I didn't realize that. No, they can say, we're not afraid of this text.
I have a lot of respect for the Catholic Church. I was actually raised Catholic too. I have more respect for it now that I know more about it. And one of the things that helped me not follow, the Age of Reason, Thomas Paine, and the other people, they point out all these things that they see as flaws in the Bible. There are people a heck of a lot smarter than me, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine. The Catholic Church they've done their job to make this theologically sound, and it's not just sweeping stuff under the rug. And you don't have to agree with their decisions and why they're doing things, but it's not just don't look at that, look over here.
Yeah,
they do have very clear answers for any question you could have.
Yep. Yeah. And I'm very sympathetic to, like, my parents still go to Catholic Mass. If I visit them, that's where we're going. So yeah. It's just since I tease them, right now it'd probably be underwhelming, but can you do the other issue that you mentioned, just to warn Catholics going into it, about the Peter Paul controversy?
Sure. This is another episode right from the Bible, and I haven't looked into this one as far as how the Catholic Church explains it. I don't entirely understand infallibility of the saints and the popes. I'm not sure how the church explains those things, but there's an episode where it's after the Jewish council in Jerusalem about you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. So that's the big issue that was settled at the Jerusalem council. And shortly after that, they were in Antioch, and Peter was up with other Jewish Christians from Jerusalem. And the church in Antioch was largely Gentile, and they'd separated themselves to eat according to Jewish law. So they didn't want to mix with the Gentiles while they ate. And it doesn't appear that they really thought it through. But when Paul saw this situation, he just exploded at Peter. He saw this situation and he thought, this is going to jeopardize everything that happened, that we decided that there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, that we're all Christians here. And he really just, with his standard, ready, fire, aim attitude, went right to Peter and just in front of everyone there, and went after him for making a mistake. And this is one place that Peter's personality really, really shined too, because it looks like Peter accepted this criticism, accepted that he was wrong. And with those two personalities working together in that situation, it really brought the church together. And that's actually an event that just solidified the church. It was probably a historical event that the church needed to be able to build strongly. But the question there is, Peter was the first pope for Catholics. So if he's infallible, I don't understand infallibility with that situation.
So what I can say for sure, like the following statement, I'm sure of, I don't know how it applies to this particular episode, but it's and forgive me, Keith, if this is like obvious to you too. The Catholic Church doesn't believe that the Pope is infallible, like in general, and even that the Pope speaking on religious matters is necessarily infallible. My understanding is they think, though, that occasionally if the Pope says, right now I am speaking infallibly, that then he's not wrong when he does that. And so I think the way they would handle this is to say, Peter did not say to Paul, no, when I said that we should separate and, obey the dietary rules that Moses handed down, I was speaking infallibly, so get out of here like that. Since he didn't say that and he said, okay, then that must mean.
You need a disclaimer there. Yeah. Well, in the book, I added even Peter's not infallible. Even Peter's not perfect. So it was kind of, but it was supposed to be fun and lighthearted. It wasn't supposed to be an actual slap.
Yeah. Well, geez. So I guess, can you do a Protestant who's fairly familiar with this stuff? Are there going to be any surprises to them in your book? And like, on the one hand, I don't want to spoil it, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying, is there going to be stuff in there that they're going, I didn't, or, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that, but yeah, right, because it says that in Corinthians and it says this, and so therefore, yeah, I never even anyway, I'm just.
Yeah, I spoke to somebody who has a radio show in New Zealand, a Christian radio show, and he's been very devout for decades now. And he said to me that the book really changed his perspective of Paul and what Paul was thinking when he was when he was living, when he's going through building the church. And I think that there's going to be something for everybody in the book. There's going to be something that you didn't think of. You might disagree with the personality I put there, but I think that a lot of Protestants, and this is kind of maybe a little bit leftover from before I was more involved in the church, and maybe a little bit of cynicism left over from that time. But I get the impression that a lot of Protestants see the apostles as pretty uniform, because they're all good, right? So when you picture a good person or a Christian or this, you kind of have this ideal in your mind, and it I might be wrong, but I get the impression that a lot of Protestants impute that same personality to each of the apostles with maybe different colored beards. And I think that this really draws out that personality especially. And again, he's the outsider apostle who really has a wildly different personality than any of the other apostles. So yeah, I do think it brings an interesting take. And I think that any Protestant that would enjoy watching The Chosen and feels like they get something out of that, even though they know the Gospels thoroughly, could likewise have the same type of experience. I'm not really comparing quality to The Chosen, but the same type of benefit from reading this book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm not trying to stir controversy, but since you've mentioned it twice now, I know is a contingent of people, Protestants on Twitter that many of them I know, they don't like The Chosen, and they say, no, you shouldn't watch that. Do you have a state, like, are you familiar with that?
I am
line of
lightly.
objection? Okay.
Yeah, I haven't followed it that closely. But that was actually kind of a hang up writing the book for me.
Mm-hmm.
I am this is the Bible, you don't mess with it. So I started just kind of bare bones, but there's so much more you need to get the picture. When you read the Bible and you read the stories in the Bible, your brain has to put together these images, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I see is helping people put these images together. And it's very easy for me. It always has been to visualize things and conceptualize things like this. So to the extent that people don't like The Chosen because it fills in gaps, their exact same argument would apply to my book. Yes. Mm-hmm. But I've overcome worrying about that because I think there's so much more to take away from this than there is, danger of, having too much filled out for you. And I would say that I hope that anyone that's concerned with that would be reading their Bible very closely to be able to make those judgments for themselves. Did he go too far here? Did he, or not even really judge, but they should know their Bible well enough that they don't get pulled this way or that way. I'm very sound theologically and for the sequence of events and things like that. So I'm confident there. I'm not worried about that type of thing.
Okay, so again, I didn't delve too deeply into it. And by the way, I only have seen a few episodes of The Chosen. Like when I was visiting my parents, they were watching it, and I didn't see. I liked the episodes I saw. I thought it was very entertaining, and it was really like I was tearing up at certain parts that were very poignant. And so when I was somewhat taken aback when I saw the level of vitriol against it, and in fairness, some people were just kind of basically saying what you said, that no, this is a blasphemous. You don't do this. Other ones, though, it was deeper where they were pointing out, oh, in this episode, they had this happen, and you can see how, and I admit, assuming they were correctly representing, if I had seen that episode and that happened the way they were describing, I also would have thought, I don't know about that one. That like it seems like maybe they're misleading people about what the text actually says. So I did see issues like that. So just so I understand, Keith, you're saying you don't think what you did in any way contradicts Scripture. You just think you had to fill in some necessary, like,
yeah,
he's got here that Paul kept breathing and his heart kept beating, but Scripture doesn't say that. How do we know? And it's like,
right. Yeah. I'm very confident that I did not contradict Scripture in the book. We know things. Well, for example, we know generally where Luke comes into the picture, and I have him by the jail cell with Paul when Paul's in jail singing. So I have him near the jail cell listening to Paul sing. That's not in the Bible. We know that's about where where Luke comes into the picture, but that he's actually there listening to Paul sing, that's made up. And I've thought about writing a PDF that kind of explains the decisions I made and explains what is in the Bible exactly and what I've embellished. And I'm getting some feedback to that some people might find that helpful. So I'm considering that, but I do not contradict the Scripture anywhere.
Yeah, the reason we can drop it after this. I'm sorry, I'm dwelling on it so much that some people.
It's important.
I imagine you're interested in it because you wrote the book, and me also as an author myself. Like to me, it's interesting to figure out. It's a fine line that you want to add something and bring it to life, but yet you obviously don't want to, especially for something so important theologically, you don't want to mislead people or introduce error. But you get clearly the Hamilton musical. There wasn't a rap battle in the cabinet where they just debated foreign policy or whatever. You know what I mean? Should we help France? Obviously, but yet you can see how, given what that is,
all thrown off now.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, I don't begrudge them for doing that. Like, I think that was a very entertaining thing. And if it got a lot of people into, you know what I mean? So like, I'm okay that they did that, but clearly they made some decisions. Or like the Napoleon movie with, what's his name? Joaquin Phoenix. You know, I imagine they didn't have him losing a battle that the real Napoleon won or vice versa, but there was a lot of stuff in there about his relationship with his wife that I wondered when I'm sitting there watching the movie, is this, you know, they're kind of making him a certain character, and I'm wondering, was the real Napoleon really like this, you know, maybe. Anyway, I'm just saying there's like a spectrum of, or another one would be the movie A Beautiful Mind about John Nash. Mm-hmm. Like that, they were, I'll just say this just to give you an example in case you don't know. Did you see the movie, Keith?
I did not see that.
Okay, so it's with Russell Crowe. People know. So it was a great movie as a film. I enjoyed it in the theater. Russell Crowe, I thought, did a great job. But then I read the book, and it was like they have him. He goes nuts, and in the movie, he thinks he's like working with the CIA or something, and it turns out that's all in his head. And in the book, yeah, he gets delusions of grandeur, but in the real world, it was he would go into the faculty lounge because he was working at Princeton, I think. And he would throw the New York Times or something on the table and say to the other professors, "Hey, you see that headline?" And they'd say, "Yeah, because that's aliens communicating with me." And so I'm just saying, like,
right.
He wasn't. The book said nothing about him thinking he was working for the government, you know, cracking codes to beat the Russians. Or anyway, so I remember thinking like, that was kind of a stretch that, you know, Ron Howard was okay with on this script. So anyway, I'm just saying you can see how people decide to take liberties with historical fiction. So I was wondering what your philosophy was.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that helps me clarify a little bit here. I don't contradict the scripture in any way, but I also try to be very careful not to be misleading. Mm-hmm. I don't want to lead anyone away from understanding the scripture or to give a false impression. So my focus was on, you know, highlighting the truth and making the truth pop out for people more. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, it wasn't just that I didn't contradict the Bible. I did work to keep within that framework.
Okay, very good. So if people want to get a copy, where should they go?
Well, you know, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere. It's available anywhere. But I would add that I had worked with an amazing actor for the audiobook. I got a great studio, and Eduardo Ballerini was available for doing the performance in the audiobook. And I didn't think about it at the time. I just wanted to find a good actor to do it. But the way the book was written from the first person perspective, it's Paul telling you, I did this, I did that. Mm-hmm. Well, that really opens up a whole world for an actor.
Yeah.
So he was able to really put himself into it. And I got I'm a little embarrassed to admit it because I'm the author, but this is the first book I've ever liked the audiobook better. And I think if you're at all into audiobooks, that would be my recommendation, would be Audible. It's Spotify. It's in most audiobook formats now. You can get it. So if you're at all into audio, it's just a fantastic actor. And we're so blessed to have him do this work I got to point you to that.
Okay. I'm glad you, once you said it, it was obvious to you, but yeah, I hadn't thought of that. So I'm glad you did think of that and you got someone to do a good job with it. So if you're watching the video, folks, here, it's Paul's Journal. Well, no, of course my camera's not focusing on it. Paul's Journal. Keith Dixon is the author. Keith, thanks for your time and for writing this book, and I hope people benefit from it.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.